This meeting is being recorded.
So, hi everyone, welcome to ATARC's What's Out There Overview of Standards, Mandates, Tools, and Solutions to Manage Cyber Supply Chain Risk webinar and roundtable. This was actually put together by the Supply Chain Risk Management Working Group as the first in a series of supply chain discussions that they would like to do. Today we'll be hearing from a few great panelists as they discuss kind of their supply chain experiences and findings. ATARC stands for Advanced Technology Academic Research Center and is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. So welcome to all the attendees. Thanks for joining us today. Before we begin, I do just want to encourage the audience to submit any questions of their own that they might have to the Q&A section of this platform down below. We'll be going through them kind of during the discussion, so if you have them, please send them in. And I'd like to pass things over now to our moderator, for today's event, Mike Van Woude, to introduce himself and our other speakers for the day. Mike.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and a pleasure to be with you all. What we're going to do is we're going to go through a little bit of what SCRM is and the significance of it and the impact that it's had on not only federal, but the community, both on industry and the general public worldwide. Interesting time that we're going through, and I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves. We're not going to go through everything that we've done in our careers. We'd probably go through the end of the session without expressing anything. So at this point, I'm going to start off by letting Naki introduce himself. I am currently with CISA as a contractor, working on what else but supply chain risk. Naki, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Nake Woude. I am the Supply Chain Risk Management Director at the Office of Information Technology category at the General Services Administration, GSA. Thank you.
Brian Paap, cohort that I work with over at CISA. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Brian Paap, I work for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, pronounced CISA, not CISA, but CISA. Previously, I worked over in the National Reconnaissance Office on supply chain issues over there, or cyber supply chain specifically, as well as cybersecurity capabilities on vehicle systems for satellites.
Thanks, Brian. Katherine, would you
Hi,
like to
I'm
announce
Katherine.
yourself?
I'm Katherine Hutton. I'm a senior strategy consultant with StealthPath and previous experience with the Secret Service, Army Cyber Institute, and Schneider Electric that have helped provide some perspective on supply chain issues.
Thank you, Katherine. Robert's a cohort. We've engaged at panels before together. Why don't you introduce yourself, Robert?
Absolutely. Robert Salvia, Vice President of Professional Services for Fortress Information Security Government Solutions. And we provide cybersecurity solutions for critical infrastructure as well as DoD and federal agencies.
Thanks, Robert. And finally, Stan Wisserman.
Hey, thank you very much, Mike. It's great to be here. Stan Wisserman, I'm Chief Technologist for CyberRes, which is a business unit of Micro Focus. Previously, I was the CISO at Fannie Mae and served on DHS working committees on how you can better secure the acquisition and supply chain. It's great to be here.
Great, thanks, Stan. As you can see and hear, we have a lot of talent on the committee, so looking forward to getting started. We're going to begin by just getting a definition of CSCRM. And so we're going to start off with Naki, and he can give us his words of wisdoms, and then we'll chime in with a couple of other inputs and get their background and information. Naki, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So in order to define cyber supply chain risk management, which referred to as CSCRM, there's a need to really understand the concept of supply chain. So when you purchase something, for example, a car, you receive something simple and tangible, a car. What you don't see are all the activities that occur in between from the time, from making the car to the time it gets to you, right? That includes designing, developing, manufacturing, handling, etc. Right? These activities are all components that make up a supply chain. And so simply put, supply chain is really a linked set of resources and processes beginning at the origin of a product or service and ending at the consumer. So really, any person, service, or product involved in the creation and use of a product or service is part of the supply chain. Now, what about in the context of information communications and technology, right? So in this context, the supply chain begins with the design of ICT products and services and extends through the development, sourcing, manufacturing, handling, etc. Of ICT products and services, and delivery of them, to the acquirer, if you will. There are different types of supply chain risks, including cybersecurity, financial, legal, environmental, among others. Our focus is on cyber supply chain risk. And these are those risks that arise from threats that exploit vulnerabilities within products and services, traversing the supply chain, as well as threats that exploit vulnerabilities within the supply chain itself, which result in adverse impacts to organizational operations and assets. And so with this concept, the idea of understanding cybersecurity supply chain risk, the idea of cyber supply chain risk management becomes obvious, right? And that's the management of these risks, right? And when we say management, really, we're talking about the systematic identification, assessment, and responding to risk and monitoring risks. And that's really what CSCRM means. Over.
Thank you, Naki. Just a point I wanted to add about what Naki talked about in an automobile. When I was at GSA and I was on the fleet management committee, GSA manages about 300,000 to 500,000 vehicles in terms of what they're doing. So when I was on the fleet management committee at GSA and we were talking to Ford and General Motors, it was about Wi-Fi in cars. And all of a sudden you're on a public network and you've got your government phone and you're doing your phone calls in your cars on a public network. That's the kind of risks that go into supply chain risk. That's the kind of governance that we have to have with third-party suppliers. So I just thought I'd throw that out. Anybody else like to comment on it from the team?
I would just like to add another dimension is that sometimes your suppliers might not realize that they have a problem or that they are posing a risk. So that's another dimension of thinking about all the different perspectives you need to have on how you're going to handle supply chain risk.
That's absolutely right, Kathleen. And another example of that is on contingency. A lot of organizations move to the cloud with their technologies, et cetera. And one of the examples is that typically when we move to a platform, to a cloud, like we do with any one of them, whether it be Amazon or Google, et cetera, on a platform, the way the government has is they work with integrators who are managing the day-to-day operations of that cloud performance. And in a contingency, if we lost Amazon's entire website, if I was the CIO, who would be calling me? Is it the integrator? Is it the reseller? Is it the cloud service provider? All of those things today, from a contractual standpoint, need to have attention and need to be ironed out. And you need to, if you're the CIO, you should have that information available to you. So it's a great example, Kathleen, thanks. Any other comments about that?
Yeah, I think that everybody has made great points. And I think cyber scrim is really just an extension of what would be considered traditional or logistics scrim. where we talk about, the financials of companies. Are they able to make what you need in the quantities that you need and deliver them on time where you need them delivered? And that's kind of defined SCRM throughout acquisition. But now when you add a layer of cyber SCRM on top, all of that still applies. You still have to make sure they're capable of providing the assets that you need. But now you need to take one other look through a lens and say, should they be making it? Depending on what type of product it is, what type of processing it does, where is it coming from? Are they adding additional risk from a cyber standpoint, which is not necessarily looked at through traditional SCRM? And that's where the cyber SCRM can layer on top of that and should be complementary for a comprehensive cyber SCRM solution.
Robert, you make a very good point. There seems to be a lot of confusion out there when people talk about SCRM, cyber SCRM, or even cybersecurity SCRM. That takes it even deeper, one more level, because it's taking the overall SCRM higher level and you're breaking it down to what really impacts your mission, right? So that's why I like the way you put that as cyber SCRM, because that's definitely where we dwell.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. So we'll go on to the next question now. And Katherine, this is for you. What should be the focus of cyber supply chain security strategy, specifically regarding domestic challenges and international threats? So I'd like to get your thought process behind that.
Sure. I think it's comes down to risk management. Much like you're looking at other raw materials or workforce gaps, cyber supply chains should just be another part of your risk assessment. And I think the more we can normalize it, the more and easier it is for people to be able to adopt that concept, as well as translate SCRM into terms and measurements and methods that we're used to when we look at risk across the entire enterprise. So risk is the first thing that I think of.
And Mike, I'd like to add on to that.
Stan?
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I
Stan.
agree. I agree with Katherine on that as far as risk, but I do think that it does require a cultural transformation, and it is a coordinated kind of multidisciplinary kind of approach that an agency or enterprise has to take. And you do need to engage stakeholders from both inside the organization and outside the organization to collaborate and communicate and take actions. And I think you have to recognize you have unintentional threats to the supply chain. Think of open source software that is vulnerable, that developers use, that wasn't necessarily intentionally with malicious. And you do have those domestic and international threats that could do it. The outcome you ultimately want is that heightened awareness and preparedness, right, for potential applications. And I do think that having somebody, if you think about your strategy and how you're going to resource it, having somebody on point who's leading this effort to help with that orchestration and coordination, making sure the processes are in place. If you do have a 0-day like Log4j, do you have the processes to quickly identify, where those components in your software potentially are introducing risk into your application. So you need to have all that put in place.
So I want to
Thanks,
add,
Stan.
I want to add to that also information sharing. Supply chain risk information sharing is critical, to inform risk practitioners about their practices and helps them mature their practices. And also, most importantly, when you have when you're part of a community of sharing, for example, the FASC, right, Federal Acquisition Security Council, that's within DHS currently, right, that facilitates information sharing. One of the things that there are several advantages, and one in particular, for example, is besides just being aware to mature your own risk by getting information to mature your own risk program, and also sharing that, if you're also able to monitor target trends. For example, if supply chain is targeting a particular sector, right, through sharing is where you begin to get that information, right? So being part of a sharing community is important, and most importantly, formalizing that process is also critical to avoid, because there are challenges. Folks have proprietary materials, folks have information they don't want to share, you can get into trouble by sharing certain information you're not supposed to share. So that's an important factor to consider.
No, absolutely. And I certainly appreciate that, Naki. And my current role with CISA, in addition to what we're trying to do with developing PMO, Program Management Office, I'm on the Information Sharing Committee that supports FAST, the Federal Acquisition Security Council. And information sharing is critical, both from the industry side, from the end user side, and from the accountable offices. So it's supply chain risk is in any one of those entities and needs to be looked at for governance, for processes, for procedures in order to manage that relationship. Why don't we move on to question 3? Brian, this one's for you. So how does the government and industry respond to the need and address the cybersecurity? And what's your thoughts behind that?
So how do they address the need for CSCRM within the federal departments and agencies? That's a very good question, and something that we've been working on for the past 2 years. We currently ran a pilot, and the pilot was figuring out, all the steps and everything it takes to actually stand up and sustain a CSCRM program within federal departments and agencies. So we really got a lot of good lessons learned. And from that, we were able to develop what we call overview and guidelines document. So this overview and guidelines document really takes NIST 161 and some elements of NIST 853 Rev 5 and a couple other resources. So we pulled it together because we need this to make sense. I can throw somebody 161 and say, hey, go do this, but it's not going to work. That's an enormous document to go through, and I have to be able to do something with it. So what we tried to do is turn all of this that NIST provided, that industry provided, and DoD into how you do that. So essentially turning the what into the how is the overview and guidelines document for standing up and sustaining a CSCRM program. So that took about 9 months to put together. We're still in the draft stages, but we should have some type of final draft within the next few months of what this should look like. Because right now, I would, based on my interactions with the departments and agencies out there, there's just a lot of them that are just coming out of the womb on this, right? They don't have their legs under them, or they're crawling. Very few are actually jogging, right? So back in 2013, there was an executive order for specific agencies to stand up a CSCRM capability. Those agencies are much more mature than all the others. Now in 2018, the Security Act said, hey, go stand up a CSCRM program, you CFO Act agencies. That really didn't happen. Right? There's no planning in that. So in 2020, we held listening sessions with the CFO Act agencies, and they said, can you just tell us how to do this? Can you give us boilerplate language to better protect ourselves? So we listened to them, we acknowledged, and that's what really drove us into the pilot and where we are today. There's definitely a lot more that can be done for the federal government. And I would say the number one issue across the board is funding and resources. Over.
Hey,
Thanks. Good, Stan.
Yeah. And I would just want to point out that obviously those that are providing software to the government on the industry side of the equation will hopefully, as Brian points out, be the recipient of some of that set of requirements of what they need to do. Well, more broadly in industry, there are a number of efforts going on there as well. I want to put some highlights on. You have Google with their supply chain levels of software artifact, or SALSA. OWASP has their software component verification standard, SCVS, and that establishes a set of common activities and best practices in organizations that has a maturity kind of process in there too, 3 different levels of maturity. The Cloud Foundation also has some. So there are a number of things out there. And I think also industry is, in general, those that produce software, whether it be products or just in general, certainly have had some wake-up calls in the last 2 years, right? Between Solarwinds sunburst, between the Log4j, et cetera. We've had wake-up calls, and consumers are asking for evidence that measures are being taken on their side, and we're the industry is having to act.
Yeah, great points, Stan. Only because, as he mentioned, with what went on with, a couple of suppliers in terms I was on the counterfeit and fraud committee for CISA back when CISA first became an agency, and hacking. It turns out to be really costly, not only for the government and industry. It becomes really expensive for the supplier, right? Fixing code, things that get into devices, device management, whether that hacking takes place on code inside a desktop, a laptop, a phone, whatever. That's also becomes very expensive for industry. The retrofitting, all of that stuff takes place. So their investment is not only to make sure that we're clean inside the house, but their own product is clean, their service is clean. And that's an extensive process. SCRM is an everyday event. We're globalized now, and even with 5G coming down the road back here, it's going to expand endpoint technology that is really significant. I mean, you think endpoint technology today is profound with 5G infrastructure. So the size and scope of risk management really gets profound in terms of how we develop the processes and the procedures. You'll never be 100% pure, but you got to have the governance, the processes, the procedures, and the tools to maintain and try to best keep that process clean.
Mike,
any other quick comments?
Well, just a quick comment here. You talk about the government and industry, that communication channel that really needs to be established whenever we're requiring industry to do a thing. So what if we were to take a look at it a little bit differently? What if the federal government were to provide a capability for then industry to submit to for an evaluation of X? That way they don't have to go through an arduous process of making sure that they had all of these tools and people to do these things to assess the product for it to move forward. Rather, the government has that and asks industry to submit for the evaluation, for then the federal government to make an assessment, a risk-informed decision on the product, whether they want to procure it or not. So that really takes it down to a specific level. Look, the federal government will save millions of dollars because they don't have to do this 101 times. Industry can rely on this capability to do those fact-checking steps for the software and return potential vulnerabilities, not exploitable, but vulnerabilities, so they can then rewrite code. So we're taking a look at those aspects and seeing how we can leverage that to reduce the stress on industry as well as government.
Great points, Brian.
So,
Thank
Brian,
you.
I was also assuming that by the government doing it, industry doesn't have to now be doing the same thing for different agencies. So it does save the industry a lot of time and money as well.
Yeah.
Correct? That's another advantage.
And that's really
I think
a lot about what this is about, is changing the mind culture, that it's not about getting a certification. It's not, and you've not heard anybody mention the word compliance. It really is about risk management, and you need to have a program in place, because even if you're 100% compliant, you can add as many controls as you want. You're still going to have to manage risk. We talk about 0 days or Log4Shell, or just, open source code that hasn't been exploited yet. You're going to have to manage that risk. And by setting risk thresholds and having programs in place across your entire global vendor network and managing that risk across the life cycle of a platform, that's really what we're talking about. And you can start to see that cultural shift going from getting a check in the box and a certification to building out programs that manage risk.
You're right, Robert. So one of the main things I'd like to stress, change management is critical. Today, changes, the evolution of change happens either weekly, monthly, depending on the product and the service. And change management and the quality control of change management, both from industry side as well as the end user side, right? Or the service side or the recipient, if you will, is really critical before you put it into production and put it online, because that's where a lot of the exposure can occur. Stan, were you going to say something else?
Yeah, Brian, there was a question that came up and maybe you're best to answer it, but basically, this outline of how you stand up a CSCRM, is that publicly available? And if it is, where would you find it?
So I would say, Jenny, let me put my email in here and we'll connect, because we're getting that adjudicated, because I want this to be as transparent as possible. In its current state, it's not there yet. So I just want to make sure that we have a clean, usable document that can be leveraged for industry and government.
Great. Let's move on to the next question before we run out of time here. And some of this we've already touched upon. So Stan, I'll ask you this, and then we'll go over to Naki. I'm sorry. I think the next question is, what is the government's requirements and how do we make people aware of the things and track things? So let me go with, let me see, who is this first? Robert is supposed to address this first. So we'll do this to Robert, then move on.
Mute.
So yeah, as far as government requirements go, and I think Brian hit on a few of those as well, where you talk about the NIST 853 revision 5, so there's a whole new family of controls solely focused on supply chain risk management, but it goes so much far beyond. I mean, just in the past 3 years, we've seen executive orders come out, Executive 14028 with transparency on SBOMs. The adaptive acquisition framework with the DoD instruction 5000.90 specifically directs program managers and milestone decision authorities on cybersecurity in supply chain risk management to include cyber supply chain risk management. So you can see, as we've gone through this kind of cyber awakening and gone through NDAA 1647 of asking them to go out and find where your cyber vulnerabilities lie, a lot of those vulnerability reports have come back saying that one of the highest vectors of attack is the supply chain, to include the software supply chain. So now we're starting to see these regulations come out and really start pointing laser focused on the supply chain and understanding specifically the cyber supply chain risk management posture of those programs, and we've seen that with NDAA 889, sections A and B, where now we're actually calling out banned entities and partnerships, and they're really getting down to that subcomponent level, that component level of your software that's saying any of your vendors, and that's where the DoD 5000.90, it calls out assessing all of your vendors for basic cyber hygiene. What is their patching policy? Have they been breached? All of that basic cyber hygiene, are they able to protect your data, which, similar to the CMMC requirements. So there really is, the regulations are coming out, but it comes back to taking all of those regulations and building out a cyber SCRM program that you can put in place, because it's not about just being compliant with today's regulations. It's really about managing the risk. We've had so many regulations come out in the last 3 years. There's going to be more regulations coming out, perhaps more banned entities. You're still going to have to deal with 0 days and exploits. So you have to have a platform and a program in place that allows you to be adaptable and flexible in a very dynamic environment. And I think that's where, again, that mind shift is coming, that to Katherine's point, it's treating this like any other risk to any other program, but just providing the tools to manage that risk, which is slightly different from what would be considered an easily kinetic risk or physical risk, because with cyber, you have pivot points and so many other factors that you have to take into account.
So question, Brian brought in the value of the NIST 800-161 and, taking that, Brian, and making it actionable, right? Should government agencies view 161 strictly as guidance? And how potentially help them? Or is that, should they be viewing that differently?
So it is guidance, in my opinion. NIST, having a lot of discussions about 161 with NIST, it's purely guidance. Now you get into some of the appendices. Now that's a little more actionable things that you can do to your program to improve it. When it comes to acquisitions, they've got other templates in there that you can actually use. And that's really the problem with it, with NIST doctrine, is that they're asking you to do these things, but there's just no method to carry that forward on how to do all those things. So rather than 101 agencies doing it 101 different ways, we wanted to set the parameters around it and guide them through the process of doing this the right way.
I
Yeah,
just want
that's-
to.
I was just going to say that I was on that committee, the 161 and the revision, and it's right. Brian's absolutely right. It is a guidance document, but there's suggestive methodology there that makes you think that some of these things you need to, especially was leading to. There's some processes, et cetera, associated with commonality is best, especially for enterprise products. You want standards, you want commonality. It provides you with a better management of the processes, looking across all agencies rather than every can you imagine what we'd look like without any guidance there? We'd be all over the map. So it's absolutely necessary that those provisions be followed as suggestive, but as best you can. Any other comments?
When you look at those too, they will say that these control sets and overlays, they are tailorable. So how do you go about tailoring them? And it really comes down to the criticality. And we talked about this, the criticality of these systems to the mission. So you have to have some sort of mission defined with mission essential functions and mission supporting systems to understand that, based on the criticality, you will want to be more secure all the way through the entire supply chain. You may have a higher risk threshold for a non-critical system, but it's still important that you assess that risk, illuminate that risk, and then make the informed decision to either accept it or to go put in remediations in place, whether they be technical solutions or procedural solutions. And that's what we talk about, managing your risk. You're always going to have risk, specifically from cybersecurity. So now you just have to make sure that you are properly illuminating it and accepting it or remediating it where possible.
So I just want to point out also that NIST special publications are guidance documents, right? You have some FIPS documents are mandatory. So you have some NIST documents that are mandatory, but the SP 800 documents are guidance. And wanted to add that supply chain risk management is not the easiest of risk management. I was previously a chief risk officer, so I have experience in enterprise risk management, built those cybersecurity risk management, and also some other risks like business continuity. Supply chain risk management, it's a different level of difficulty because you have to think about managing risk throughout this system development lifecycle, and also think about managing risk, integrating risk with your acquisition lifecycle and managing risk at every step of the acquisition lifecycle. That's difficult. That's not easy. It's a challenge. And that's why Brian and his organization are offering to help and it's not easy for organizations to do this, especially if you don't have a solid risk management background.
And that
I'll just jump in and build on that if it's okay. So when making sure that people are also including OT systems when we're talking about managing supply chain risk, because oftentimes in conversations, we think about just the IT side. I worked in a product and systems security office, and that was our job to make sure that security was built into the systems that were in products that were, say, going to industrial control environment. So that just adds to the complexity, because how you deal with those pieces of the supply chain from the IT and the OT side are going to be a little bit different.
Thanks, Catherine. We really need to move on now. So otherwise we're going to run out of time. And the next question, though, is going to Naki, it's for you, and I think you've already alluded to some of them, but tell us some of the potential challenges that, I think the audience would appreciate.
Yeah, I'll go through this a little fast. As you said, we're running out of time. So there are several challenges with implementing and managing supply chain risk management. Common one is resources, right? Everyone needs resources. And we've heard in the news, scarcity of resources, and you compare that to the magnitude of what we're dealing with supply chain. And resources are both risk management and also contracting personnel, obviously. And then there's also training your workforce. Everyone in an organization needs training. And when it comes to supply chain risk management, now we're not talking again about just those that are in technology or in risk. There's those that are contracting office, HR, legal, finance. They all should be part of your of the risk management group or working group or council, making decisions when you go through your acquisitions, right? And then there's also an important one here. They're all important, but one of the ones that I see the most challenge is also defining supply chain risk control requirements that you set out for vendors. And then from the government perspective, right, when you define requirements, one of the biggest challenges is trying to strike the right balance between what is really required as far as controls and what is sufficient. The concern here is when it comes to small businesses with limited resources, right? Both in personnel and finance. You want to make sure that the requirements are not adversely impacting their ability to operate. And so striking that right balance without sacrificing security, important securities, it's critical. And then, of course, you need tools. Having tools, illumination tools like AI-powered tools will be important to provide you information about supply chain to ensure that you're in compliance with laws such as 889 and others. And then I already talked about sharing risk information, which is essential to ensure that you can get access to information that is critical to understanding and addressing your supply chain risks. I'm sure the others, the other panelists, we have others to add to this.
Anybody else have a comment before we move on to the next question?
I guess one of the things, and you hit about it as far as the need to inject throughout the acquisition lifecycle and the contract, the controls. But I think, again, it's worth stating again, integrating in, your security requirements into contract language itself is critical. And I think one of the challenges many times, and Brian this is part of the toolbox you're helping create, is understanding what appropriate level of contract language to specify, and having examples that you can pull in. I think, again, if you don't ask for it contractually, you're not guaranteed to get it. So that's just one of the other points I'd like to make.
Thanks, Dan. The next question is also interesting, right? So how's the community responding? How are to the tools, to the solutions? So I'm talking about industry. How are they responding to this, right? And I know from my own experiences, where the challenge has been, from my perspective, is when you're dealing with a large supplier with lots of third-party relationships. And how do you get your arms around that? How do you show that quality? And who owns that quality assurance, right? You have some third parties to third parties. So that becomes really challenging for some of the suppliers today in managing business. If you look at companies as large as Cisco, right, where all the manufacturing is made in China, et cetera, and not manufacturing made in China, and then they have third parties delivering components to those products. Those are real challenges when you're dealing with international products or suppliers. So any other comments that you'd like to feedback on that? I think, Brian, have you got any insight that you'd like to pass on? Comments?
Yeah, I'll do it quickly so I can pass it over to others, because I know that others have some really good thoughts that they can pull from this. Where do you start with that one? I mean, it's just, it's a it is a heavy lift from the industry side, right? Dealing with second and third party vendors, for example, their software, right? So how do you pull that apart and determine whether it meets the criteria or not, right? Do they pull it apart from that second and third tier vendor, or do they just add it on and scan it in the end? Because as you know, most software is built probably on 80 to 85% open source, and their proprietary code is just slapped on top of that. So it's a hard problem. It's vendor illumination. It is software verification and validation. How do you go about doing that? Many different ways. I like to look at it as rules before tools. You need to have the methods down before you can perform the actions, because you don't know if the actions you're performing are correct unless you know what it's supposed to be based on your mission. So you can look at various capabilities that will be able to pull like an SBOM for you, an ops bomb, firmware bomb. So, those are things that get down to specifics of the code outside of the code, right? The connectivity that software is hoping to establish that many people don't know, right? The software goes into operations and is making these connections. Well, if you had the ops bomb that would give you that information, then you could say, no, turn that off and turn that off, because we don't want them making that connection as root. So I'll stop there. I'm sure that others have a lot more to say about this too.
I know Stan
I was
wants
just
to
gonna-
add something.
I was just going to
I'll
add
come
in
to
terms
you.
of, Brian, I like the rules before tools, because I take a best practice from law enforcement, which is a chain of custody program. So how can you look at your supply chain the same way that law enforcement handles evidence, and making sure that it hasn't been tampered with and it is in a state that you need it to be in to apply it for some specific reason.
Yep.
So
I'm sorry. I think one of the other things I've seen come as far as a role within a lot of vendors is the product security officer as a distinct set of responsibilities. And, their role is to help monitor the security of the products being, going into production. Many cases ensuring that it's built in, security is built in and considered throughout the product, the SDLC for each of the products and the releases. Serving as a gate before they go GA, general availability. I do think that there's a lot of work on trying to ensure that the code repo that the developers are drawing upon are, that the code that's, vetted is put in that repo and it has been approved. A lot of organizations, the vendors are ensuring that the open source that is being leveraged, they're tracking, and they have the ability to have that visibility, the line of sight as to what components and libraries are being used in their products to be able to react quickly. I mean, certainly, again, lessons learned this last couple of years that they need that to be able to give confidence back to their customers that they're on top of things.
Thanks, Stan.
Yeah, and I want to
Naki, do you
point
have
out
something?
that, I just want to point out that I know Brian also talked about software. It comes to hardware, there are big challenges, particularly with white label, which I think Brian alluded to as well. So, the idea that you get a tool, that's made by an entity that you're familiar with, but under the hood is a completely different entity that might have made that product, and that might be a prohibited entity, like Huawei, for example, right? But on top, you may say XYZ, which is maybe acceptable to you, but under the hood might have been some other entity. That's a big problem. That it's an engineering problem that tools may not be able to tell you that under the hood is actually an entity that you wouldn't have approved of. And I know there are tools that use maybe shipping information and et cetera to provide information, but it's very limited.
Great.
And I think that goes back to the direction and putting it in the contracts and what is allowable. When we talk about, some of those changes down below level 2 are allowable, and they don't have to notify the customer as long as the form, fit, and function hasn't changed, and you're still able to deliver something that is meeting the requirements. But what we have to do is start flowing down those cyber requirements that says this has been designated as a critical cyber component. You are not allowed to make, changes below layer 2 on any processing components, without notifying the customer and assessing the risk therein. But, right now, they're allowed to do that at that level. So we really have to get better at writing those recommendations and requirements. And CISA, they have the ICT SCRM task force, which has been set up with industry, government, to really come up with certain working groups, specifically on HBOM and SBOM, and coming up with those best practices, merging all of those together and putting out tool sets and even just recommendations.
Thanks, Robert. We've got to move on to the next question. So there's Naki, this is back to you. And we've talked a lot about this already, but where's the best tools? How do I get, we've talked about 800-161 in terms of practices, et cetera. But any recommendations from your side, Naki, about tools, practices, and how do we deploy and things of that nature?
So there, no one tool does it, can do it all, right? But there are several tools out there that are, as I mentioned before, artificial intelligence powered tools that can provide illumination into your supply chain, right? It can provide information as far as, legal and regulatory compliance of a product or service, also financial, issues potentially with a vendor, cyber security issues, governance, geographic location as far as where the product was made, and to an extent, affiliates and subsidiaries. The biggest challenge that we deal with is affiliates and subsidiaries. Understanding, for example, if you're dealing with 889, right? You have 5 Chinese entities that are not allowed to, you're not allowed to obtain the product made by them or the affiliates and subsidiaries. So having illumination into those subsidiaries and affiliates is quite challenging because, this is a moving target. They forge relationships, affiliations every day, and you don't have this one list that will provide you this information or a tool that will provide you exhaustive, information. So you rely on the tool, but you also, at least we do, go online and also do some additional searches online. Go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. No, I was going to say there's really 2 entities in tool sets that Naki is referring to. One side is all of your engineering tools, the things that are looking at vulnerabilities, counterfeit, fraud, things of that nature that run in the infrastructure that your engineering side of the house should be doing. The other side is all your processing capabilities, right? So there's a lot of suppliers getting into the framework, and so to speak, as Naki is referring to. There are recommendations, there are processes on the schedules that we go through to make sure that we're providing the right governance and tool set as best we can for agencies. The other thing about agencies is there's enterprise and there's common tools for your email, for those kinds. Then when you get into the mission side of the business, it becomes very agency driven under the OCIO about how you manage your mission type businesses. That's a whole different set of tools in terms of how you manage those vulnerabilities because it's specific to the mission. So I just wanted to add that 2 cents in, Naki. I'm sorry if I interrupted.
Yes. No, that's correct.
So any other comments quickly before we go to the final question for the group?
Yeah, I think the important thing when you talk about tool sets, and what we've learned, through critical infrastructure and what we're bringing to the DoD as well, is that there's no shortage of tools that do a piece of this or data gathering tools. And what you wind up with is a lot of data. And what you really need is to focus on a tool that brings all of that together and, complements whether it's traditional SCRM, cyber SCRM, compliance, and really puts that into a single pane of glass that you can, merge across all of those different pillars. But more importantly, it has to be operationalized. You have to take that data, operationalize it, and run it like a risk management program so you know where to focus, how to set risk thresholds, and how to track your remediation to closure. So you really are in real time or near real time managing that risk and being able to adapt. And that's where the tool sets are developing and helping the operators execute the requirements that are being written.
We like to call
Thanks,
the
Robert.
360 view of risk, right, Robert? You need to be able to look at everything around you and be able to have that perspective of, you know, the vulnerabilities, but you also have other things you need to be considering as well.
Exactly, and breaking down those stovepipes, because there's risk out there that is somebody else is aware of that you are not aware of, that if you can put those pieces together and respond accordingly, it's more efficient, and ultimately it increases your cyber resiliency.
It's
We're working on that.
Collaboration and information sharing. It's key, right? You can't do without it. Final question. What help is available for agencies today? Who provides the help? What, helping comply with the mandates, et cetera, et cetera. Stan, you're on the hook for this one.
Well, I think we just all need to distribute Brian's email address and, make sure everybody has that out there in the world. And, all the upcoming things coming from CISA, obviously NIST has done a lot of work. I do think that's some great guidance out there on GSA, right? On Naki, you guys have a center of practice. So I think there are a number of resources out there, and they're going to be growing. I mentioned a few of the other ones in the industry space, because it's not just a government viewpoint on this, or those that aren't even providing software to the government are also worried about how they can manage this risk of their supply chain.
Yeah, there's also a big FAR language that's going to be coming out. It's going through the FAR Council right now. There's also TAI SCS 9001, which is, there's a paywall there, but what it does is it lays out vendor requirements that would better secure the vendor's product before delivery to you. Now, it's self-attested, but it's certified. That's more of the front end of this.
So on the chat, I'm just going to put 3 different links I've recently shared. And one of them is CISA's website as well, supply chain. And
I'm going to put the NIST document out there too.
Yeah, the NIST guidance is I included as well.
Comment.
I think.
Lost you, Mike.
All right.
Mike is going in and out, so I'm not sure. We lost his video.
So any other comments or any other, can you hear me?
Do we have
Yes.
another question?
You guys hear
I can
me?
hear you now, Mike.
Oh, there you go. Is there any other questions or comments or questions for the group?
Okay.
Any other? Good. Nicole, you're on.
Well, thank you guys all for joining and going through all the information with us, specifically Supply Chain Risk Management Working Group for setting this up. All you guys did an awesome job. And thank you to everyone else for joining us today. And we hope to see you at ATARC's next event.
And there's a question about whether the recording will be provided from Kevin. Okay.
Yes, so the video, Kevin, will be on ATARC's YouTube channel, and it'll be under the past events on ATARC's actual website too. So you can find it in a couple places. I'm gonna hopefully get that up this week. But yeah.
Super.
As if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to email. But outside of that, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.